The last drops of the thunder shower had hardly ceased falling when the pedestrian stuffed his map into his pocket, settled his pack more comfortably on his tired shoulders, and stepped out from the shelter of a large chestnut tree in the middle of the road. A violent yellow sunset was pouring through a rift in the clouds to westward, but straight ahead over the hills the sky was a color of dark slate. Every tree and blade of grass was dripping, and the road shone like a river. The pedestrian wasted no time on the landscape, but set out at once with the determined stride of a good walker who has lately realized that he will have to walk farther than he has intended. That, indeed, was his situation. If he had chosen to look back, which he did not, he would have seen the spire of much Natterbury, and, seeing it, might have uttered a malediction in the unhospitable little hotel, which, though obviously empty, had refused him a bed. The place had changed hands since he went last for a walking tour in these parts. The kindly old landlord on whom he had reckoned and had been replaced by someone who the barmaid referred to as the lady, and the lady was apparently a British innkeeper of that orthodox school who regarded guests as a nuisance. His only chance now was Stirk on the far side of the hills, a good 6 miles away. The map marked an inn at Stirk. The pedestrian was too experienced to build any very sanguine hopes on this, but there seemed nothing else within range. He walked fairly fast and doggedly without looking much about him, like a man trying to shorten the way with some interesting train of thought. He was tall, but a little round shouldered and about 35 to 40 years of age, and dressed in that peculiar kind of shabbiness which marks a member of the intelligentsia on a holiday. He might easily have been mistaken for a doctor or a schoolmaster at first sight, though he had not the man of the world air of one of those or the indefinable breeziness of the other. In fact, he was a philologist and a fellow of Cambridge College. His name was Ransom. He had hoped when he left Natterbury that he might find a night's lodging at some friendly farm before he had walked as far as Stirk, but the land this side of the hills seemed almost uninhabited. It was a desolate, featureless sort of country, mainly devoted to cabbage and turnip, with poor hedges and few trees. It attracted no visitors like the richer country south of Natterbury, and it was protected by the hills from the industrial areas beyond Stirk. As the evening drew in and the noise of the birds came to an end, it grew more silent than an English landscape usually is. The noise of his own feet on the metalled road became irritating. He had walked thus for a matter of 2 miles when he came aware of a light ahead. He was close under the hills by now, and it was nearly dark, so that he still cherished hopes of substantial farmhouse, until he was quite close to the real origin of the light, which proved to be a very small cottage of ugly 19th century brick. A woman darted out of the open doorway as he approached it, and almost collided with him. "I beg your pardon, sir," she said. "I thought it was my Harry." Ransom asked her if there was any place nearer than Stirk where he might possibly get a bed. "No, sir," said the woman. "Not nearer than Stirk. I dare say they might fix you up at Natterbury." She spoke in a humbly fretful voice, as if her mind were intent on something else. Ransom explained that he had already tried Natterbury. "Then I don't know, I'm sure, sir," she replied. "There isn't hardly any house before Stirk, not that you won't. There's only the rise where my Harry works, and I thought you were coming from that way, sir, and that's why I came out when I heard you, thinking it might be him. He ought to be home this long time." "The rise," said Ransom. "What's that? A farm? Would they put me up?" "Oh, no, sir. You see, there's no one there now except for the professor and the gentleman from London, not since Miss Alice died. They wouldn't do anything like that, sir. They don't even keep any servants except for my Harry for doing the furnace, and he's not in the house." "What's this professor's name?" asked Ransom with a faint hope. "I don't know, I'm sure, sir," said the woman. "The other gentleman, Mr. Devine he is, And Harry says the other gentleman is a professor. You don't know much about it, you see, being a little simple. And that's why I don't like him coming home so late. They said they'd always send him home at around 6 o'clock. It isn't as if he didn't do a good day's work either. The monotonous voice and the limited range of the woman's vocabulary did not express much emotion, but Ransom was standing sufficiently near to perceive that she was trembling and nearly crying. It occurred to him that he ought to call on the mysterious professor and ask for the boy to be sent home. It occurred to him that just a fraction of a second later, that once he were inside the house, among men of his own profession, he might reasonably accept the offer of a night's hospitality. Whatever the process of thought may have been, he found that the mental picture of himself calling at the rise had assumed all the solidity of a thing determined upon. He told the woman what he intended to do. "Thank you very much, sir, I'm sure," she said. "And if you would be so kind to see him out of the gate in the road as you leave, if you know what I mean, sir. He's frightened of the professor, and he wouldn't come away back once your back was turned, sir. Not if they hadn't sent him home ourselves." Ransom reassured the woman as well as he could, and bade her goodbye, after ascertaining that he would find the rise on his left in about 5 minutes. Stiffness had grown upon him while he was standing still, and he proceeded slowly and painfully on his way. There was no sign of any lights on the left of the road, nothing but the flat fields and massive darkness which he took to be a copse. It seemed more than 5 minutes before he had reached it, and found that he had been mistaken. It was divided from the road by a good hedge, and in the hedge there was a white gate, and the trees which rose above him as he examined the gate were not the first line of a copse, but only a belt, and the sky showed through them. He felt quite sure now that this must be the gate of the rise, and that these trees surrounded a house and a garden. He tried the gate and found it locked. He stood for a moment undecided, discouraged by the silence and the growing darkness. His first inclination, tired as he felt, was to continue his journey to Stirk. But he had committed himself to a troublesome duty on behalf of the old woman. He knew that it would be possible, if one really wanted to force a way through the hedge. He did not want to. A nice fool he would look, blundering in upon some retired eccentric, the sort of man who kept his gates locked in the country, with this silly story of a hysterical mother in tears because of her idiot boy had been kept half an hour late at his work. Yet it was perfectly clear that he would have to get in, and since one cannot crawl through the hedge with a pack on, he slipped his pack off and flung it over the gate. The moment he had done so, it seemed to him that he had not till now fully made up his mind, and that he must break into the garden if only to recover the pack. He became very angry with the woman and with himself, but he got down on his hands and knees and began to worm his way into the hedge. The operation had proved more difficult than he had expected, and it was several minutes before he stood up in the wet darkness on the inner side of the hedge, smarting from his contact with thorns and nettles. He groped his way to the gate, picked up his pack, and then, for the first time, turned to take stock of his surroundings. It was lighter on the drive than it had been under the trees, and he had no difficulty in making out a large stone house, divided from him by a width of untidy, neglected lawn. The drive branched into two a little way ahead of him, the right-hand path leading in a gentle sweep to the front door, while the left ran straight ahead, doubtless to the back premise of the house. The other, which he now began to approach on the house, was overgrown with moss. The house itself showed no light. Some of the windows were shuttered, some gaped blank and without shutter or curtain, but all were lifeless and inhospitable. The only sign of occupation was a column of smoke that rose from the house, behind with a density that suggested the chimney or a factory, or at least of a laundry rather than that of a kitchen. The rise was clearly the last place in the world where a stranger was likely to be asked to stay the night, and Ransom, who had already wasted some time in exploring it, would certainly have turned away if he had not been bound by his unfortunate promise to the old woman. He mounted the 3 steps which led him into the deep porch, rang the bell, and waited. After a long time, he rang the bell again and sat down on the wooden bench which ran along the long side of the porch. He sat so long that he thought the night was warm, and the starlight and the sweat began to dry on his face, and the faint chilliness crept over his shoulders. He was very tired by now, and it was perhaps this time which prevented him from rising and ringing a 3rd time. This, and the soothing stillness of the garden, the beauty of the summer sky, and the occasional hooting of an owl somewhere in the neighborhood, which only seemed to emphasize the underlying tranquility of his surroundings. Something like a drowsiness had already descended upon him when he found himself startled into vigilance. A peculiar noise was going on, a scuffing, irregular noise, vaguely reminiscent of a football scrum. He stood up. The noise was unmistakable by now. People in boots were fighting or wrestling or playing some sort of game, and they were shouting too. He could not make out the words, but he heard the monosyllabic barkings of men who were angry and out of breath. The last thing Ransom wanted was an adventure, but a conviction that he ought to investigate the matter was already growing upon him, when he heard a much louder cry ring out, in which he could distinguish the words, "Let me go! Let me go!" And then, a second later, "I'm not going in there! Let me go home!" Throwing off his pack, Ransom sprang down the steps of the porch and ran around to the back of the house as quickly as his stiff and footsore condition allowed him. The ruts and pools of the muddy path led him to what seemed to be a yard, but the yard surrounded with an unusual number of outhouses. He had a momentary vision of a tall chimney, a low door filled with red firelight, and a huge round shape that rose black against the stars, which he took for the dome of a small observatory. Then all this was blotted out of his mind by the figures of three men who were struggling together so close that he almost cannoned into them. From the very first, Ransom felt no doubt that the central figure, whom the other two seemed to be detaining in spite of his struggles, was the old woman's Harry. He would like to have thundered out, "What are you doing with that boy?" But the words that actually came out, and in a rather unimpressive voice, were, "Hey, I say!" All three combatants fell suddenly apart, the boy blubbering. "May I ask," said the thicker and taller of the two men, "who the devil are you, and what are you doing here?" His voice had all the qualities which Ransom's had so regrettably lacked. I'm on a walking tour," said Ransom, "and I promised a poor old woman—" "Poor woman," said the other. "How did you get in?" "Through the hedge. I don't know what you're doing to that boy, but—" "We ought to have a dog in his place," said the thick man to his companion, ignoring Ransom. "You mean we should have a dog if you hadn't insisted on using tartar for an experiment," said the man who had not yet spoken. He was nearly as tall as the other, but slender, and apparently the younger of the two. His voice sounded vaguely familiar to Ransom. The latter made a fresh beginning. "Look here. I don't know what you're going to do with that boy, but it's been long after hours, and it's high time that you have sent him home. I haven't the least wish to interfere with your private affairs, but—" "Who are you?" bawled the thick man. "My name is Ransom, if that is what you mean, and—" "By Jove," said the slender man. "Not Ransom who used to be at Weddenshaw?" "I was at school at Weddenshaw." "I thought I knew you as soon as you spoke. I'm Divine. Don't you remember me?" "Of course, I should think I do." In actual fact, Ransom had disliked Divine at school as much as anyone he could remember. "Touching, isn't it?" said Divine. "The far-flung line, even in the wilds of Stirk and Nutterberry. This is where we get a lump in our throat and remember the Sunday evening chapel at the DOP. Don't you know Weston, perhaps?" Divine indicated his massive and loud-voiced companion. "The Weston. You know, the great physicist. Has Einstein on toast and drinks a pint of Schrodinger's blood for breakfast. Weston, allow me to introduce my old schoolfellow, Ransom. Dr. Elwyn Ransom. The Ransom, you know, the great philologist. Has Josprin on toast and drinks a pint of—" "I know nothing about it," said Weston, who was still holding the unfortunate Harry by the collar. "And if you expect me to say that I am pleased to see this person who has just broken into my garden, you will be disappointed. I don't care twopence what school he was at, nor on what unscientific foolery he is at present wasting money that ought to go to research. I want to know what he's doing here, and after that I want to see the last of him." "Don't be a fool, Weston," said Divine in a more serious voice. "His dropping in is delightfully apropos. You mustn't mind Weston's little way, Ransom. It conceals a generous heart beneath the grim exterior, you know. You'll come in and have a drink and something to eat, of course." "That's very kind of you," said Ransom. "But about the boy—" Divine drew Ransom aside. "Balmy," he said in a low voice. "Works like a beaver as a rule, but gets into these fits. We're only trying to get him into the wash house and keep him quiet for an hour or so till he's normal again. Can't let him go home in his present state, all done by kindness." You can't take him home presently yourself if you like. Ransom was very much perplexed. There was something about the whole scene that seemed suspicious enough and disagreeable enough to convince him that he had in on something criminal, while on the other hand, he had all the deep irrational conviction of his age and class that such things could never cross path of an ordinary person except in fiction, and could least of all be associated with all the professors of an old schoolfellow. Even if they had been ill-treating the boy, Ransom did not see much chance of getting him from them by force. While these thoughts were passing through his head, Devine had been speaking to Weston in a low voice, but no lower than he was to be expected of a man discussing hospitable arrangements in the presence of a guest. It ended with a grunt of assent from Weston, and Ransom, to whose other difficulties a merely social embarrassment was now being added, turned to the with the idea of making some remark. But Weston was now speaking to the boy. "You have given enough trouble for one night, Harry," he said, "and in properly governed country I'd know how to deal with you." "It weren't the wash house," sobbed the half-wit. "You know it weren't. I don't want to go into that thing again." "He means the laboratory," interrupted Devine. "He got in there and was shut in by accident for a few hours once. It put the wind up him for some reason. Oh, the poor Indian, you know." He turned to the boy. "Listen, Harry," he said. "That kind gentleman is going to take you home as soon as he's had a rest. If you'll come in and sit quietly in the hall, I'll give you something you like." He imitated the noise of a cork being drawn from a bottle. A guffaw of infantile knowingness broke from Harry's lips. "Bring him in," said Weston as he turned away and disappeared into the house. Ransom hesitated to follow, but Devine had assured him that Weston would be very glad to see him. The lie was barefaced, but Ransom's desire for a rest and a drink were rapidly overcoming his social scruples. Preceded by Devine and Harry, he entered the house and found himself a moment later seated in an armchair and awaiting the return of Devine, who had gone to fetch some refreshments.